Happy Tuesday, everybody. So, about every other Tuesday is what my current schedule looks like. We can do these community deck techs. And so these are deck submissions that people put in when I put out the bat signal in the community tab. And if you'd like your own deck reviewed by the community, then look for the post your community deck tech thing in the community tab. So I only can pick out about 4 each time we do this, and priority is given to YouTube members. So we're going to start off here with the Gruul Prowess control build by Dr. Brand MX. And it's hard to call this a control. It's Gruul Prowess with a larger amount of interaction than we typically see. And so the first thing I like to do is I go over the lands, and you're running 22 right now, which is pretty standard for Gruul Prowess. One of the things, though, you are adding in 2 additional copies of Rin's Resolve. And so for every 3 to 4, I think it's like 3.3, 2 or 1 costed things that help you dig, you can then shave a land. And so it would be a little bit of a stretch, but you could play 21 lands in this build. And as far as the colors go, you only have 7 sources of green on turn 1. The rest are tap lands or verge lands. And so really you're looking at the 13 sources of green kind of moves this over here, which is fine. You know, you're not really looking to do the Paw Patch Recruit on turn 1, where you can just do it on turn 3. So I guess what I want to talk about right now is what's the advantage of building it like this, right? So we've got the 2 Torch the Towers as well as the 4 Burst Lightnings. And we've got a couple of missing cards from the Gruul Prowess build that I talked about in the meta review yesterday. So just really quickly, Ghost Vacuum for against Azorius Oculus. The Hired Claw is an alternative to the Monastery Swiftspear. These are all just things in case you hadn't thought of them, right? Scorching Shot is particularly nice for domains specifically, where you can shoot your own Screaming Nemesis without having as large of a board, which is nice after like a post-Sunfall kind of situation, where you can hit them for the 5 damage and then prevent them from gaining life, which is more important with the Zur Leyline Binding being animated as a 6/6 lifelinker kind of thing, right? So I miss the Scorching Shot for that matchup. And we also, Sentinel of the Nameless City has been particularly good for the mirror match, and you could explore that as a card. The way that you have this set up, as we're going to get into, is I think better set up for the mirror match and worse against some of the other matchups that you might experience. So Soulstone Sanctuary also has made its way into the lists because of having the mice synergy. So I have seen that 1 or 2 copies starting to find their way in, and so especially since you already could sort of be on 21 lands, you may want to consider dropping a mountain for a Soulstone Sanctuary, something like that. And then you also are not running the Innkeeper's Talent, and the Innkeeper's Talent is kind of, you know, take it or leave it. I'm not super concerned that it's missing from this list, but still something to consider, the pros and cons. So if we look at like Dimir midrange has changed quite a bit, because now the more popular archetype is Dimir Bounce. And so against Dimir, your worst card, one of your better cards used to be Burst Lightning and Torch the Tower, because it was a tempo deck. Now it's more of a control deck, and so your Burst Lightnings are actually pretty bad, because if you're just shooting like the 1/1 Prowess off of Storm Chaser's Talent, that's not really what you want to be doing, right? So the best card against the Dimir Bounce deck is the Paw Patch Recruit, where you punish them for the single point interaction. So with the popularity of Dimir Bounce, I would consider getting the Paw Patch Recruit up to 2, or at least having the option to bring this up to 4 for that matchup, just because it is your best card in that matchup. The worst cards against the mirror are your Monstrous Rage, and that's largely because they're going to be bringing in the single point interaction, which leads to 2-for-1ing yourself with the Monstrous Rage. And then the Paw Patch Recruit does not work particularly well in the mirror match, which is why it's typically included as a sideboard card, 2 to 4 copies, so that you can take it out when you are up against other Gruul aggro strategies. The best card in the mirror is Torch the Tower, again, for the same reason that the Monstrous Rage is bad, is that you're going to up the amount of interaction against your opponent. And then the Screaming Nemesis is particularly good against the mono red prowess decks. So you do have the 4th copy here. Keeping it in the sideboard's fine. You can bring it in when you are up against that matchup. And then the 3rd most common one on the ladder. So it really depends on what you're doing for like an. If I think you were mentioned that you were running this in an RCQ, but on the ladder, the 3rd most popular archetype is going to be Domain or the Zur Enchanter deck. And as I mentioned, one of the best cards against that strategy is to have the Scorching Shot option and Lithomanic Barrage. And you have the 3 copies of Lithomanic Barrage, which I like to see. And I already talked about the Scorching Shot Screaming Nemesis line against Domain. So overall, you can hopefully that kind of gives you an idea of why I think this deck is a little bit more set up against the mirror match, less so good against the Dimir bounce strategy. Now, you also have a couple of inclusions that we don't usually see, which is the Wren's Resolve and the Tranquil Frillback. I'm not sold on the Wren's Resolve because it is largely a 4th copy of Questing Druid. There are some slight variations in it, and like you have to do this on your instep or your opponent's turn for it to act like a Wren's Resolve. But it does allow you to do that because this is an instant, whereas this is a sorcery. The one upside to Wren's Resolve is when you have a whole bunch of mana and you do it on your turn, you can play those cards on your turn and the following turn, whereas Questing Druid is limited to the one turn. But they're similar enough that I would think I would just run the 4th copy of the Questing Druid and maybe not the Wren's Resolve, just personally. And then Tranquil Frillback, I like this card. I think that it's relatively well positioned because you've got the enchantment hate side of things for the Dimir bounce. You have the graveyard hate for Azorius Omniscience and Azorius Oculus, and then you have the gain 4 life, which isn't the worst case scenario in the mirror match. And then you also get good targets for like Domain with the Up the Beanstalk. So I think it's relatively well positioned to have the Tranquil Frillback. And then your sideboard is pretty good. I'd say that the Urbresk's Forge is a little bit out of date, just because we do see more of the authority of the consuls coming in, which kind of negates the strategy. And then like Tidebinder in Dimir kind of comes and goes. But you could have it kind of well timed where everybody's taking the forges out of their strategies, and then so other people are going to sideboard out their strategies against the forge, and then suddenly the forge becomes good again, right? So, but right now we're seeing kind of a moving away from the Urbresk's Forge, and so you can kind of compare what you have to the list that I covered on Monday, and you can kind of see the variations between the 2 lists, right? Pop Hatch formation here instead of 4 copies running just the 2, because you already have the enchantment hate from the Frillback, so I like that as well. And then 2 copies of the Obliterating Bolt works well against the Enduring Curiosity, works well against the Haughty Djinn in Azorius Oculus. I could see this being a Scorching Shot too. Like you have the Lithomanic Barrages for the Azorius matchup as well, though. So Pyroclasm we see sometimes being run as 1 copy instead of 2. Depends again on how much you're anticipating Gruul aggro. And so the way that you have this built is more likely to do well against the Gruul aggro outside of the Pop Hatch Recruit being in the sideboard, or being in the main instead of the sideboard. And that's going to be beneficial for if you're climbing the best of 3 ladder on Arena. And depending on your RCQ and depending on how popular this archetype is, I can see the approach that you're taking it. So thanks for the submission. I hope my comments find you well, and I hope they made sense. Next up was Counters by Visual D16, and so that I believe they have submitted a Selesnya Counters build before, so this is kind of the evolution of the archetype. It's always fun to see how it's been changing throughout the weeks. And so again, what I like to do is I start out with the lands. So you've got this curve. I would run 23 in paper or in best of 3, but because I think this is for best of 1 with considerations in the sideboard, you can get away with 22 in best of 1, especially if you don't have a whole lot of 4-drops. And the 12 sources of white on turn 1 and 16 sources of green on turn 1, I would tweak a little bit because at least want to give yourself the option, I think, of playing the Paw Patch Recruit on turn 1. If not, then you can kind of, I still like to have, for these split cards, have 14 sources. And so to make these a little bit more consistent, you have enough, you have an equal split between 18 and 18 on turn 2 after the tap lands don't count. But I would consider taking out 2 forests and adding 2 plains. And that's largely because the Verge land taps as a forest already on turn 1 and not as a plains. So you can kind of hedge it a little bit more towards the being able to actually have the white mana on turn 1. And that would make it that would make it easier for you to cast things like your Optimistic Scavenger on turn 1, which I think you want to do in this deck. So yeah, I misspoke. You have enough green to do the Paw Patch Recruit on turn 1. You don't have enough white to do an Optimistic Scavenger on turn 1. So I'd like to tweak that. So just really quickly, 2 notes from YouTube. So after they submitted this deck, they said that they had replaced the 2 copies of the Royal Treatment with 2 copies of Invasion of Gobakon. And I'm glad you suggested that, because I was going to suggest that, because it's less dependent on having a board. And you have 5 right now that are targeting, if you have no board, then they're just dead cards in your hand. So I like the Invasion of Gobakon. It's another white card. So again, I think my change of getting the additional plains for the 2 forests makes sense. And overall, my general notes on it, I wasn't sold on the I wasn't sold originally with the inclusion of the Innkeeper's talent. Just because when I see Calyx, I assumed this was a go tall strategy that was kind of like Selesnya auras, and then the talent doesn't work very well if you have a large amount of auras and not a large amount of creatures. But you have 22 creatures in here, which makes it better at the counter strategy at the price of making the Calyx a little bit worse. Because you would usually see something like Audacity, for example, so that your creature, you have a higher amount of auras, so you have a higher chance of them being enchanted. But there is still synergies of Calyx and the Steed and the Brawler, all getting the +2/+2 from the Wiltleaf Liege, that I like it enough that Calyx doesn't have to be the center point of the deck, like it does in Selesnya Auras. One of the cards that I'm not sold on, though, is Valgavoth's Lair, and that's partially because it's a tap land, where you want to play your tap lands on turn 1 so that you don't run into that problem of tripping on mana, and so you can curve out. And the downside to that is then the Valgavoth's Lair coming in on turn 1 gives you no synergies with the enchantment ETB, right? So it works better in an archetype where the overall enchantment count matters rather than on the ETBs. Or if you're more heavily leaning into the enchantment ETB, and this deck isn't really doing that, it just has the Scavenger. So I don't think there's enough for me to justify the awkwardness that this can create. So I wouldn't be on the Valgavoth's Lair just personally. And then I was also curious, so this one is going further away from the Selesnya Auras build, which runs the Toadstool Admirer, which would then make the Sheltered by Ghosts easier to get down without having to hold up the Shard Mage's Rescue. But it then makes the Paw Patch Recruit kind of worse, because usually you're playing the Paw Patch Recruit when you're going for more of a go-wide strategy or a more creature-based strategy, which you are doing here. So all in all, I really don't have too much to add other than just the quick little land changes. And I think that it looks I want to try it out. It definitely looks like an interesting build, and I'm not, I looked through your suggestions or your considerations in the sideboard, and there wasn't anything in here that was really crying out that I think you need to run it, right? And Tribute to the World is far too much in mono green to really justify, and the Honoring Tumblewag I think is always an interesting one for the counter synergies. But it's further up the curve, and I'm not sure Best of One allows you to run that many 3-drops, and the Calyx has better synergies with the Wiltleaf Liege. So, like I said, I think this is relatively well thought out. I don't have too much to add. So thank you, Visual D16, for the submission. And really, you guys kind of got me off guard this week, because I usually have something to say that I feel a little bit more useful, and really this week was a little bit more about just showcasing off your guys' decks. there's not any big red flags coming across. So again, check the lands. 24 seems about right. As far as your like most difficult to cast cards, you've got the Mind Skinner at 3 double pit blue or triple pit blue, and so that one wants 23 sources of blue, and you have 22 if you're counting the demolition fields as a blue source, which I think is a little bit of a stretch. But this deck by no means needs the Mind Skinner to come down on turn 3, so you're kind of pushing it further down the curve currently with how many non-blue sources that you're adding. This one is running the Valgavott's Lair, but because it's part of the key strategy to winning through the Scrambling Skull Crab, I can justify it being here. And it's also a little bit easier when it doesn't have to be a specific color that you're missing just to get it down at some point in the game. So the more important one for the deck to function, I think, is having the cancel or the 1 double pit blue up on turn 3. And for that one, you need to have 18 sources of blue, and you have 22. So you're totally covered there. You're looking fine. The overall synergies of this deck is to play as many Skull Crabs as possible, copying them with 3 steps ahead, copying them with Mirror Room, milling them with the Mind Skinner, milling them with Jace, and then doing a whole bunch of enchantment ETBs to trigger the Skull Crab to finish them off. So you've got a lot of removal through Unable to Scream, the Stay Hidden, Stay Silent, and Kidnap gives you all of this creature-based or creature-centric enchantment removal. And then you have the counter spells for the things that are not creature centric, and then you have Entity Tracker, which allows you to regain your cards, so you can have continue the control kind of aspect through drawing your cards through the Entity Tracker on the ETBs from your enchantments. And then the Hull Creeper can either finish off as an additional copy of the Skull Crab, giving you a ton of different what's the total count there? 12 Skull Crabs if you really wanted to go that heavy into it. And yeah, just like mill control seems like a really cool strategy, pretty well thought out. I'm not sure that it is like similar to the Selesnya Counters build. There are alternatives in the meta that exist that may be superior, right? Because one of the downsides to this is that it is creature centric, so it's going to struggle against single point interaction from like mono black, right? If they destroy your crab, you're going to be a little bit sad. But it's a unique take, and that's the point of these community deck techs. So thank you very much there, Steve Mon. It looks like a really fun deck to play. And the Fountain Port, I guess, is one that looking at the list, I was a little bit not convinced by having the Fountain Port for the additional value, because I think there's a lot of stuff that I'm already doing in this archetype for card draw and such that I would be tempted to maybe just run 4 copies of the Demolition Field instead of the Fountain Port, just so that you have more answers to the manlands, which are a little bit harder to hit with sorcery speed enchantments. And the last one that we'll talk about today is the Lizard Pings deck by JMoney9494. And so first things first, the lands, you're running this one at 24, and I think you could get away with 22. And not even in a best of 1 situation, and just in general, because of how focused on the 2-drop area you are at. Now, if you like really want Oger on turn 4, then this should be 4 copies, and that kind of, the land is like justifying, you're making sure that you aren't getting screwed so that you have the land on turn 4. I don't think it's necessary. I'd go down to 22. So the most difficult thing to cast is your Vine Lasher, your Hired Claw. So the 1C wants 14 sources, and you are well covered there with the 14 on black. You do have a fair amount of tap lands and such, but if you take out the Fabled Passages, you have 14 black for the Vine Lasher, and then even more for the red. So you're good there. There's a couple of just general notes. I guess you also have 2 CC on the Razorkin Needlehead, which wants 21 sources, and you have 23 on turn 2, where the taplands don't count against you. So that works as well. The Vine Lasher I was like, why is this not at 4 copies? And then I realized I was like, oh, it has to be a red source for Osier to make it into 4 damage a ping. So then the Vine Lasher is not going to be triggering the Osier's ability, which is probably why you have it at 2. The nice thing about the Needlehead is that it's an assassin, so it is a outlaw and synergizes with like the Laughing Jasper Flint that you have as a one of here. And then you have 10 sources of removal, which seems a little bit high to me, with the Nowhere to Run, the Torch the Tower, and the Shocks. And so 8 sources of removal gives you an 80% chance to find 1 by turn 5, which in best of 1 is kind of when things are over potentially against like mono red, if not sooner. And then 12 gives you an 80% chance for drawing 2 of them by turn 5, and is more common to what you will see in a control build. So I kind of want, this is not really a control build, right? So if you go all the way back to Lost Caverns of Ixalan, we talked about a Boros control deck that was using High Noon to limit your opponent's spells, the white sweepers, to then do a 1-turn kill with Osier, and the form of Posse that we got in Outlaws of Thunder Junction. At least I think that was, at least that's what I remember from it. So you're doing less of a 1-turn kill because you're not going to be able to trigger this as many times as you need to like finish it off to deal the 5 in 1 turn. But the Lizard strategy already kind of has the built-in ping part of it, with like Gev being able to hit for 1 damage to target opponent, that sort of thing, where you usually play an aggro strategy that you then finish off your opponent by continuing to hit them for unblockable ping damage, right? So I see why it was like a natural fit to try Osier here and the impact trimmers. But because you're not really trying to answer everything with the sweepers and have the card draw to answer more things so that you can continue to answer 1 for 1 like you would in a control deck, or try to get better than a 1 for 1 with you would with a sweeper, what I would probably do is drop the removal down to 8 from 10, and then that would make it a little bit less likely that I would want to justify running the mage here, the otter, and instead I would probably be cutting this because we're taking out some of the non-creature stuff and just lean more heavily into the original lizard build. So like bring up 1 more copy of Gev, bring in the 2 more copies of the Flame Cash Gecko, and then bring in the 3rd copy of the Vine Lasher, or because even though it doesn't synergize with Osier, it still is pinging your opponent and is a pretty decent card for the Lizard strategy. But you could also bring in a 4th copy of the Fireglass Mentor, which then helps you dig into additional resources. So that's personally where I would try exploring it in that direction. So, but really, all in all, like I said, you guys did a really good job this week. There's nothing that's like standing out to me where I sometimes I'm like, ooh, this doesn't quite make a lot of sense. Like everybody's at least on a theme. Everybody's kind of trying to execute that theme well. And so really my stuff is kind of nitpicky and just my own personal opinion. But I hope it finds you well, and let me know if you've already tried the more lizard heavy strategy. I imagine you have, because you started with Rakdos lizards and then arrived here. But maybe try tweaking down the removal a little bit. Maybe try dropping 2 lands and see how that feels. You might be able to get some more cards in that you care about. The impact trimmers too, like the other thing that's nice about the Vine Lasher, just one last comment, right, is that on 3 it triggers the impact trimmers twice, right? So it's like a very cheap way to do the offspring, and I guess it's the upside to the mage too, is that it has the cheap offspring. I just don't like it if I'm gonna go further into the lizard synergies, because then this isn't a lizard, right? And the Needlehead I like because it fits into the 1 damage, and it's a red source that can become 4. So yeah, anyway, I think I've rambled enough. Thank you everybody for your submissions, and like I said, next week, the Tuesday, a week from today, I will send out the bat signal. I will remind you all again during the meta breakers and the best of 1, best of 3 meta review on Mondays, and we'll get around to that on week 12, I think. Do we have enough time actually? We're gonna have, so if we do it, yeah, so February 4th, which will be the day before the release, or the week before the release of Aether Drift. Anyway, I'll figure it out later. Thanks for listening to my ramblings, everybody. Take care. Good luck on your RCQs and climbing the ladder. And of course, this is a community thing. So this, the reason why I did this is because I wanted to get to emulate the experience of talking about Magic the Gathering at a game shop. So if you guys have any comments that you feel free to leave it down below about like what you think you would do with the deck, or like how you would take it, what you liked, what you didn't like, etc. Right? The whole point is to have a civilized conversation and discussion about Magic the Gathering. So, take care.